I'm telling you, Louise, my best friend Janet said. He's a man, no doubt a typical man. He'll hear your proposal and immediately think about what he's going to get. Yep. I don't much like the idea of him sleeping with others, Janet. I didn't say he would sleep with anyone, Louise. He's a 40-year-old man and his best years are behind him. Do you really think he's going to be entertaining 20-year-old college girls every weekend? He'll stay home with the kids and you can run off and live your best life. Do you really think that won't blow up in my face? I looked around the table at my friends and coworkers. Louise, James is desperate to get you into bed, Annie replied. By asking for it, you'll just be able to have fun with him without feeling guilty or that you're cheating on your husband. Trust me, it's worth it, Marie added. Hubby won't know what you're doing most of the time. He'll be distracted by work, kids, and other responsibilities. Just give him some entertainment every now and then to keep him happy, and he will go through life without thinking about anything. I'll admit, the more we discussed this topic, the better it sounded. I had been happily married to my husband Mark for 18 years. We had 2 children, bought a house even though it was now our home, 2 cars in the driveway, annual vacations abroad. We both worked hard, lived poverty-free, and, for the most part, were happy. But recently, as I approached 40, I felt like something was missing. I wanted a thrill. Don't get me wrong, my husband still loved me with every fiber of his being. He's still a romantic at heart. We went on dates at least once every 2 weeks. We didn't party as often as we did in our 20s. My husband was still a handsome man, striving for success, successful at almost everything. I knew he was a catch, but I still felt bored, a sense that there was more to life. And that's when Janet started telling me about the possibilities. When the girls at my job also found out about my predicament, they too started talking about all the opportunities available. It was the modern world, they told me, and traditional relationships were becoming a thing of the past. Couples now enjoyed experimenting and sharing with each other. I wasn't sure my husband would agree to this, but that didn't stop my friends from continuing to convince me. And it was that night that finally convinced me of the need to talk to my husband. I had all the arguments I needed to convince him. As I smiled at my friends, they all smiled back as they knew what I was about to do. I'll talk to him tomorrow night after dinner, I told them. It'll be fine, Janet assured me. He'll be thanking his lucky stars. Hell, if you need me to throw him a bone while you're having fun with the young hot studs, I'm sure one of us will take him for a team. And I didn't like the thought of one of my friends sleeping with my husband. But if it gave me the opportunity to find a few lovers of my own, I would eventually find it acceptable. The last thing I'd want is for my husband to hold a grudge while I'm out with one of my boyfriends. Boyfriends? I like the sound of that. Especially the plural. I'd only had 3 boyfriends before I met my husband, and none of them had lasted longer than a few months. I never had a one-night stand. As soon as I met Mark, I never once looked at another man, and I rarely had to turn my head since then. At least until the last 2 years, when young men started showing up at our firm. They weren't shy about flirting with me, and I realized that I was still a desirable woman, and that men barely out of university were eager to entertain me. The realization that you still have everything ahead of you does wonders for your self-confidence. Coming home later that evening, my husband would have guessed nothing. It wasn't until he hugged me as usual, knowing he had no idea what loomed on the horizon, that I lay in silence, worried about the possible outcome, and let out a few nervous tears, hoping I wouldn't start getting upset the next night when I ran into him. The next day was Sunday. The kids played sport on Saturdays. My daughter played netball, my son played rugby league, so we always tried to do something fun for them as a family on Sunday. It wasn't forced, and as they were both teenagers, they preferred to spend time with their friends rather than their parents. My husband was a little more understanding of their longing for freedom, but I still loved the family time. Eventually, we headed out for dinner, but it was a little disappointing as both kids spent more time on their phones than talking to us. Don't worry, honey. The only thing distracting me is you, my husband declared. I was overcome with guilt, as I knew what I would be demanding of him in a few hours. Dinner went as usual. My husband and I made small talk, enticing the kids to talk, and Mark made a rule: no phones during dinner. The kids complained at first, but I could see that they liked that their father took an interest in their lives, always willing to ask a question or give advice. When I cooked, he always cleaned up after himself, and one of the 2 children helped him every night. Children, you are dismissed. I need to talk to your father about something, and it's not for little ears, I told them. Are you having another child? Our daughter asked rather excitedly. No, nothing like that. I looked at my husband and saw curiosity written all over his face. It's just something important. He clearly didn't know what was going to happen next, but he pulled a bottle of wine out of the fridge anyway, poured us both a glass, and sat down across from me. He looked at me, but was silent. While my husband may have been an extrovert, the life and soul of the party, there was another side to his character. Quiet, thoughtful, and contemplative. He lived his life guided by many slogans, one of which stated, "Be silent, and you will be considered a fool. Speak up, and you will dispel all doubt." I sipped my glass for a couple minutes, getting my thoughts in order before clearing my throat. "Darling, are you happy?" "Happy with what, honey?" "Happy with everything? I mean our life?" "Of course. What have I got to complain about? I have a loving wife, 2 wonderful children, a terrific home and household. We live comfortably. Our careers are going strong. We have great friends and supportive families. I think we're doing better than a lot of other people." "I'm glad you think life is so wonderful, honey. And I do too. But I'm not on the same page with you. There's something missing. And to be blunt and completely honest, I'm bored." Mark was silent for at least a minute. Then he became thoughtful again. "You're bored?" Nodding at his words, he asked, "Our marriage?" "I love you, darling. Please don't doubt that, but I need more than what we have now. I need excitement. Am I not good enough as your husband? I mean, I know we're married already. It's not about what you do or don't do, Mark. It's about me and my wants and needs." Sipping wine from my glass again, I tensed. "I've been talking to friends and doing research. Traditional relationships are—" "Don't give me the so-called newfangled nonsense your friends are spouting, Louise," Mark said stiffly. "I don't want to be taken for a fool or a dumbass. Just spit out what you want from me." I knew he knew what I wanted from him. I finished the rest of the wine from my glass. "I want an open marriage, Mark. I want an open marriage and an open relationship." For the first time in as long as I can remember, he looked at me with anger. It wasn't really just anger. The eyes, which had held nothing but love almost from the moment we'd met, changed in an instant. His fingers clenched around the wine glass so tightly I thought he was going to break it. "Can you repeat that, please?" he asked in a low tone. "Just for clarification, Louise." "I want to open up our marriage so we can date other people. Just think about it, darling. Instead of sleeping with the same woman you've been with for almost 2 decades, you could go out looking for some younger woman or even women to have fun with." He was silent, but his gaze was almost nervous. His eyes barely blinked as he silently pondered. I rarely saw my husband in anger. I knew he had a temper when pressed. I'd heard him on the phone as he dragged his coworker over hot coals. And he'd gotten into trouble more than once when he'd played rugby league as a young man. "No way," he finally growled. "I don't know what you've been reading or who you've been talking to, although I can guess who's been filling your head with this nonsense, but we're not opening up our marriage. We made vows to each other, Louise, one of which I take very seriously. Do you remember what it is?" I ran through the vows in my head and realized which line he meant. "Renounce all others," I whispered. "Bingo. And I take that oath seriously. Ever since that day when we stood together before the gala, in front of our friends and family, and while I may have looked at a beautiful woman on occasion, I certainly didn't think about doing anything with her. And now I sit here wondering how seriously you took those same vows." My friends had prepared me for all the arguments he could throw at me. "Honey," he almost growled at my usual pet name. "Mark, I still take these vows seriously, but adjustments can be made over time. We can still love, honor, and cherish each other. We can still be husband and wife. I still love and am in love with you. But I need this. I long for something else. Something you can't give me." I knew those last words would hurt him. All men have egos, and to hear my wife tell me that he wasn't making me completely happy or satisfying me would hurt. I could almost see him gnashing his teeth, his jaw clenching, rage lighting up in his eyes. But somehow he held back. I knew I'd make him angry, but I also knew he'd eventually do what I wanted him to do. He stood up, turned around, and walked to the back door. "Where are you going?" "To think," he replied. "My wife just told me she's unhappy and wants to have fun with other people. I don't really want to be around her right now. And I don't want to spend my time in the presence of whores." His voice broke as he disappeared, and it hurt me to hear him consider me with that word. I didn't see him for the rest of the night, and as far as I knew, never made it to bed. When I woke up the next morning, it was obvious that no one had slept on his side of the bed. Getting up, I took a quick shower in our bathroom before heading to work. I found our 2 kids in the kitchen at breakfast, but Mark was nowhere to be seen. Where's your dad? I asked. He left for work early, our daughter replied. Said he might be back late, our son added. For the first time in our marriage, he left without kissing me or saying goodbye. It was quite unpleasant. As soon as I got to work, I sent him a text to let him know I loved him. I didn't bother mentioning what we had discussed or what I had said to him the night before. It was simple, and I sent him the same message whenever I had time. I tried calling him during lunch, but the message went to voicemail. I left a short but sweet message assuring him that I loved my husband and that would never change. He would remain my husband, and we would grow old together, watching our children have children of their own. I wanted to think that he would listen to that and smile. At least I hoped so. That day, upon arriving home, I found no sign of my husband's car. Sometimes he would get home before me, but more often than not, by the time he walked through the door, I was already home and cooking dinner. I breathed a sigh of relief when he walked in the door, a little later than usual, but at least he was home. I was dreading getting the call that he was at some RSL club or nearby pub, drowning his sorrows and ready to put up a fight when he walked in the house. There was no kiss on arrival, just an inarticulate greeting, after which he would disappear back into the backyard again. My kids didn't seem to notice anything, sending our son after him when dinner was ready. He chatted with our kids as if nothing had happened, although my observation was that he barely uttered 2 words in my direction. When dinner was ready and they finished cleaning up, he asked the kids to go to their rooms to finish their homework, adding that he needed to talk to me. This time he didn't offer a glass of wine, sitting down across from me and hiding no anger or misery on his face. I was certain that he hadn't stopped thinking about it since our conversation the night before. I know you won't let it go, Louise, he stated after a few moments of silence. I know that one or many of your friends are filling your head with nonsense. I did my own research today on open relationships, swinging, polygamy, all that newfangled nonsense that women seem to be consuming with gusto these days. No wonder the divorce rate is just so damn high, and so many men don't want to get married these days. And yet I know that if I say no, you'll just end up cheating on me and proving you're a worthless whore. Either way, I'll end up on the losing end. He raised his hands in a sign of surrender. Okay, you win. You'll get your way. But before we agree to that, we'll need to set some damn rules. No men in our house? I wouldn't do that anyway. Our marital bed will always be sacred. Should lovers wear protection? Well, probably until they get tested for STDs. He didn't want to date or run into lovers? That should be easy enough. No fun between us if I've recently been with a lover? Well, I guess that meant less fun for him for a while. I hadn't even considered what he meant by the next sentence. From now on, I am no longer responsible for your romantic, emotional, and physical needs, Louise. Do you understand what I mean? Distracted by rude thoughts of possible lovers, I didn't understand what he meant and didn't take the time to comprehend. After all, he was still going to marry me. He was still in love with me. He was just proving what a wonderful husband he was by letting me have it. Besides, I knew it wouldn't last forever. I'd date, have fun for a year or two, no more, then I'd stop, and we'd go on with our lives as before. He stood up when he was done. The anger was gone. There was contempt in his gaze now, almost hatred. But I knew my husband well. There was pain in his eyes, and I knew it was my fault. But I remembered what my friends had told me. I needed to be selfish for once in my life. My husband was a grown man. Sure, his feelings were hurt for now, but he would get over it eventually. I guess I wasn't surprised that he didn't come to bed that night. I was ready to go downstairs and tell him to grow up. But when I was alone in the bedroom, I downloaded a couple dating apps. Found a couple fresh photos, created a new profile, told the guys I was married but didn't mind having fun, and just laid there waiting for the messages to come in. Then I called Janet. So how did it go? She asked excitedly. He agreed to it, Janet, but I don't think he's happy about it. The way he looked at me, that's just his wounded ego having to deal with the fact that you're about to have a great time. Trust me, Louise. Young men today are awesome, or maybe I'm just lucky. I know James at work is eager to be with me. I'll let him know tomorrow that I'll be free soon. Now it was time to be Louise again. Just Louise. For the rest of the week, it was cold at home. I'm sure the kids picked up on the fact that my husband hardly spoke to me, but if they did, they didn't say anything. I did my best to keep the peace. He returned to our bed, but showed me absolutely no affection. He was polite enough to say goodnight to me, but he didn't hug me, he didn't kiss me, and he certainly didn't snuggle. Friday morning, I told him I was going out with the girls that night. He hummed faintly, even though I knew he wouldn't tell me he wouldn't agree to it. He just gave me a look that I was starting to recognize, picked up his bag, and walked out of the house without another word. I had already packed a bag in case of a major fight. Whether our children noticed that their father was gone, I didn't ask. I kissed them goodbye and told them I would be home late, whether it was in the evening or the next morning. When I arrived at work in the morning, my coworkers were thrilled, and when I showed them the change of clothes and what I would be wearing, the excitement increased tenfold. I took a picture and sent it to Janet, who informed me that something was going to happen that night. I spent the afternoon letting the three young men know that I now had permission to play away from home. "Are you serious?" asked James, after I informed him that we were going out for drinks tonight. "Did your husband seriously agree to this?" "Don't mention him, handsome. All that matters is that when we're done for the day, I'm going to change and my girlfriends are going to the nearest bar. If you happen to show up, I might need company for the evening. And if you play your cards right, handsome." "What bar?" he asked, sounding rather cocky. It made me smile, for while I didn't want arrogance, I did appreciate confidence. He was young, handsome, and from the feel of it, full of energy. I told him where I would be. He smiled and said he would meet me there. After lunch, one of my coworkers approached my desk. "I saw you earlier with James," she whispered. "Are you seriously going to entertain him so soon?" "Why not?" I asked. "My husband agreed to it, so I'm not going to waste any time." "You're on Tinder?" I leaned back in my chair and laughed. My God, I've had so much interest in me within a day of posting a profile, although I have to sift the wheat from the chaff. Trust me, there are plenty of young men out there willing to have fun with older women. Pick the ones who are handsome, slender, and they usually have stamina. My husband just can't compete with that. God bless him. And how does he, deal with it? She shrugged. We don't really talk about it. He doesn't ask about what I do, and I don't ask about him. But I know he spends most of his nights at home with the kids. Does that seem fair to you? She smiled. Who says a loose relationship is fair? It's just that he agreed to it, and so did your husband. If they can't go out and find a woman, it's their fault. I bet your husband had a million ideas about how many women he was going to get. He'll probably find out that it's not as easy as he thinks it is. I wasn't so sure about that. I wasn't sure he would even go looking for another woman. He'd made it clear that he was monogamous, so him agreeing to this was rather odd. But I tried not to think about it and spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but constantly texting Janet. As soon as the clock struck 5 p.m., I hurried into the bathroom to change. I applied more makeup than usual. I took one last look at my phone, at the picture of my husband and our kids, then temporarily changed it to a regular picture and headed downstairs. Janet and the girls were waiting for me. No sooner had I greeted them than a shot glass and then a glass of wine was placed in my hand. Half an hour later, we were surrounded by a group of young men, most of whom were already in partnerships, as I was the last in the group to be either single or in an open relationship. James appeared. His eyes lit up at the sight of me. Once we found a booth, we got to talking, although it was obvious that all 6 girls had other things on their minds. Whenever we got up to dance, it was very rude. I was surprised we weren't asked to stop it. I have a room booked at a hotel nearby if you want to go, I finally told him. I'll be honest, James. I'm married, but I'm looking forward to having some fun. Asking which hotel, he practically dragged me out of there to the cheers of my friends. He knew where the hotel was. Once we got to the room, we pounced on each other. Next, I showered, got dressed, and checked out of the hotel, with the receptionist giving me a look as it was obvious James wasn't my husband. But I didn't care. Arriving home an hour or so later, I didn't make my way into the house as I had no reason to feel guilty. Finding the bedroom empty, I went in search of Mark, as I didn't see him on the couch. I found him in the study, quite surprised to find him settled on the single bed. Shaking him gently, he woke up and met my gaze. I almost flinched at how cold and emotionless they were. Go back to sleep, Louise, he said, after which he just rolled over and ignored me. Are you going to bed? I'm in bed. I told you about the rules, Louise. You think I'm going to share a bed with you after what you did tonight? Fine, then so be it. I heard him scoff, but otherwise he didn't utter a word. Back in the bedroom, I slipped into my usual clothes and got into bed. I lay awake for a good half hour, missing his presence beside me. But if he wants to sulk and sleep alone, that's his problem. If it kept going on like this, I just wouldn't come home. For the first couple months, I limited my date nights to Friday and Saturday nights. I did my best to maintain the same old relationship with my husband, but I realized very quickly that he would rarely share a bed with me now, and I guess it couldn't be helped that the kids were picking up on something. When I asked Mark about it, he threw me a scathing look and offered to explain to them what I had asked him to do. You agreed to it, I objected. Under duress, he growled. Either agree or be tricked. Either way, you were going to go out and have fun. But the one thing I wasn't going to give you was a divorce. You weren't going to take the kids away from me. I would never have taken them away from you. Bullshit, Louise. You've proven yourself wimpy since you made that request. All that matters to me now is that our children are not harmed by your behavior. And believe me, they know that. They're not blind. I wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole right now. I have no idea what STDs you're carrying around right now. I flinched at the bile that came out of his mouth. I knew he was upset, but the hatred and anger took my breath away. I would have slapped him otherwise, but I had a feeling that if I hit him, he would have no problem hitting me back, and much harder at that. Things continued to get even more cold. In many ways, we were a marriage in name only. I couldn't remember the last time he had hugged or kissed me. Sex? We hadn't had sex since I asked him to. Whether he missed it with me or not, I didn't know and didn't feel confident enough to ask. Did I miss him? I'll admit that I missed him. I missed being in love with my husband. Missed the way he held me in his arms as we came down from the high. But I wasn't going to give up what I was doing just yet. And almost every weekend I had a new date on Tinder. That all changed when Janet and the girls suggested we meet regularly after work. It went from Friday and Saturday nights to 1 or 2 nights during the week and at least 1 night on the weekend. Sometimes I didn't even make it home. Not always with a guy. Sometimes I slept over at Janet's or a friend's house, too drunk to get home safely. I started storing my clothes at work or at Janet's, as it saved time going home to change and then going out. I'm sure after about 6 months there came weeks where I didn't go home at all more than once or twice a week. I was living my best life, but I didn't realize the damage I was doing to my marriage and my family. Mark is the beginning. I'll be honest from the beginning. The night my wife approached me with this request, my love for her died. Some may ask how I could so easily fall out of love with the one I had been in love with for 20 years. Honestly, quite easily. It's betrayal and disrespect. With a few words of her plea, she betrayed everything our marriage was held on, trampled on the vows we made, and in my mind, it was just an excuse for her to go and cheat on me without guilt. And as I went outside to cool down when I was ready to snap, I realized that I just had to turn off my emotions and deal with this whole issue calmly and logically. She was disputing all of my arguments, and it was obvious that she had been coached by her friends. I knew exactly who it was that was telling her things like this. In addition to the anger and resentment, there was also the frustration that my wife might have bought into it. I knew I needed to talk to someone. Only one person came to mind. Walking over to my shed, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed her number. Hi, Mark. Hi, Emily. She was silent for 5 seconds before asking, Okay, something's wrong, Mark. We've been friends for 35 years, so don't think you can fool me. Everything poured out. There were no tears. That would come later. No, what came out of my mouth was anger and hatred. The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. In those moments, I hated my wife only because she took a few minutes to rip my heart out and crush it in her hands. I don't remember exactly what I said. All I know is that it wasn't pleasant. Are you sitting down, Mark? No. Have a seat, Mark. I'm going to tell you what you need to do. It's not going to be the same as what I did with Adam. This was different. You're going to have to play it differently. It's going to be hard, but that's the only advice I can give. Rely on me, Emily. What am I supposed to do? Part of me thinks I'll just walk away, but then I'd leave the kids behind, and if she ends up doing what she wants, hell knows what will happen to them. Besides, I could fight for custody, but we know how that turns out for a lot of men, and I'm not going to be a part-time dad. And forget about co-parenting. Here's what you're going to do, Mark. You stay married only out of convenience. Turn everything else off. The romance is dead. Block out your emotions. You will no longer be a shoulder for her to cry on or lean on. You are no longer the person she comes to for emotional support. And you certainly don't want to be doing that with her now, do you? The thought of making love to my wife after she's been with a lover makes me want to become sick or incredibly violent. No one wants me as a sloppy second. Exactly. That's why you've completely cut yourself off from her, except for the financial aspect. Keep your house. Keep your kids. Focus on yourself and them. Do the things I've been doing. Go to the gym. It's good for your body and your soul. I think I could lose a few pounds and tighten up some areas. Exactly. Fill your time with other things. Find a hobby or two. Reconnect with friends you may have lost touch with. And most importantly, focus on the kids. Show that you are the parent who cares about them. Kids aren't stupid. They'll understand what's going on. And if she does decide to do this, I can guarantee you how it will go down. It'll start out slow, but eventually she'll close her head and focus on her own wants and needs. Have you seen this before? Mark, I'll be honest with you. She'll probably end up having fun with a bunch of guys, but eventually she'll find one lover she'll probably fall in love with, and then she'll have to make a decision. Stay with her family, which will be in name only, depending on how far things go, or she'll leave you and the kids. Fantastic, I muttered. Part of me suggests you just leave now, but I realize I want to stay in my house with the kids. So do what I said. Go to the Greystone. What is that? It's used against abusive or manipulative people. Louise is obviously one of the latter. She has completely manipulated this situation to her advantage. The basics of the Greystone are that you show complete disinterest in her as a person and make any interaction with you unrewarding. Don't give her anything of yourself. It will be difficult and you will fail at times, but try to hide all emotional reactions and make everything you say short and direct. Will it work? More than likely, as I believe her request comes from disinterest in you and your family. Given how you feel right now, you don't want to have any emotional ties with her. Now you are under no obligation to share anything if that is what you want. The best idea is to reduce any conversations to the subject of your children, almost as if you've split up and become co-parents. I sighed, and she added quietly, and I'm here for you, Mark. Always have been and always will be. Love you, Em. Love you too, big guy. It's hard right now. It always is when a relationship ends. I've seen a couple other men who put up with that shit. They're both divorced now. Focus on your kids and yourself. Things will work themselves out. Will you forgive her? No. We'll divorce eventually. I'll wait until our youngest is 18 if necessary. We'll live in the same apartment, but we're nothing more than neighbors now. That's a good way to think about it. Just don't do anything stupid. I won't, but I'll take the necessary steps to protect myself. There's nothing wrong with that, Mark. Where will you sleep tonight? Not in the marital bed, that's for sure. I'll be visiting you soon, Mark. You're going to need friends for what's ahead of you. Thanks, Em. One more thing, Mark. I know it's hard to think about, but you have to take advantage of it. Women will love you. You're successful. You're trim and handsome. You're a great father. So go out and find yourself some beautiful young women. Go on dates. I'm not sure. Just think about it, Mark. You deserve to be happy too. Going Greystone was hard, and I'd snapped at Louise more than once. Each time I berated myself for it, but in the end, she got exactly what she wanted. So what did she care? The first night, when she'd stayed over and was clearly having fun with someone else, had nearly killed me. Then, she had the nerve to come to my office and ask to join her in bed. I barely restrained myself from spewing out all the thoughts and feelings I had for her. When she left my office and went back to her bedroom, I realized that any residual love I might have felt for her died that night as she went about her business. I will always have some love for her as the mother of our children, but the passion I once had for her had completely faded away. I hardened my heart, preparing for the inevitable. Following Emily's advice, I focused on myself and the children. I resumed going to the gym, took long lunches, not wanting to go too early or late at night, hired a personal trainer for the first few weeks who devised a workout and diet plan. When Louise started coming home less and less often, I took over cooking for the kids and realized I wasn't really that bad in the kitchen. And it was something I could bond with my daughter over, as she loved helping me cook dinner in the evenings. When Louise started disappearing on weekends, I realized that I couldn't be in two places at the same time. My son and daughter were playing sports at about the same time. That's when I turned to my younger sister for help and realized I would have to explain what was going on. To say she ragged on me for putting up with it would be an understatement, although I told her it wasn't putting up with it. It was that I was doing it for my kids. She was humbled when I explained to her everything I was doing and finally asked, "You should just break it off and leave with Emily." Huh? She looked at me like I was an idiot. Honestly, she's the one you should have married. Before I could answer, she held up her hand. Yeah, I've heard all that before, about your friendship and not wanting to ruin it. But look where it's gotten you. The cheating whore wife. Do you even know where she is now? Best not to know, I muttered. One of the rules. When was the last time you did this? She shrugged and shook her head. Not in the mood? I don't want to talk about it. Mark, find a pretty girl and rock her world for one night. That's what Emily suggested. My sister laughed before I asked, Do you know anyone? My sister laughed and then laughed at me. Please, at least 3 of my friends still hold a candle to my rather handsome older brother. She squeezed my hand. The gym sessions are paying off. Getting a six-pack yet? I feel more fit than I have in a while. And when I work the bag, imagining her, or a myriad of faceless boyfriends. Wouldn't I seem awful if I admitted I see her sometimes? As long as you don't actually hit on her? When was the last time you two talked to each other? Last week when she was home for dinner. The only topic I discuss with her is the kids. She doesn't seem to notice what's going on at all. Spent all her time on her phone. When she was in the shower, I looked. 3 dating apps, and there must be messages from several dozen men on there. I have no idea who or how many she's having fun with. I paused before adding, and the thing is, I don't care at all, because she's now my wife in name only. An absolute goddamn slut, my sister muttered. I agreed, but saw no point in putting it into words. A waste of energy. I had more important concerns right now. Besides my sister, Emily was the one person I relied on the most. The kids already adored Aunt Emily, but as their mother slowly faded from their lives, they began to appreciate when Emily was around, especially my daughter. Emily never stayed overnight, but we spent many evenings sitting together on the couch and usually having a drink or two. Sitting together turned into cuddling, but I didn't let it go any further than that. At least, not yet. Daddy, why do you put up with this? My daughter finally asked at dinner one night. My wife still managed to come home at least a couple times a week for dinner and still slept in the marital bed, probably not noticing that I had already moved most of my stuff out of it. Yeah, the kids at school tried to tease us about it, but we actually went along with what they called mom, my son added. I guess we're not the only kids of parents who are divorced or in weird relationships. Sighing to myself, I glanced at Emily. She threw me a reproachful look before I looked at my children again. Did your mom ever tell you about what was going on? Not really. Just said that things might change in the future, my daughter replied. Dad, we're not little kids. We know everything from the internet. Just tell us what's going on, my son stated. We certainly won't judge you. At least you're here. I can't remember the last time my mom said 3 words to me. My daughter wiped her cheeks, and I realized she was missing a positive female influence. Emily reached up and hugged her in seconds. I won't go into details, kids. You don't need to know. But your mom made me change our relationship. I only agreed because if I hadn't, I would have lost the house and you. Do you still love her? My daughter asked. No, I answered bluntly. My love for her basically died the night she made the request. It died completely that night when she came home late for the first time after her first date with a man who is not her husband. Does she even love us anymore? My daughter asked, barely holding back. Emily hugged her even tighter and looked at me. Of course she loves you, I replied, but I felt like I was lying to her. Funny way to show it, Dad, my son remarked wryly. Sighing, I realized it was partly my fault. Look, kids, all I can do is continue to be the father I've always been. I'm doing everything I can to make sure that what she's doing doesn't affect our little family. I will always be there for you so you can count on me. I can promise you that. My sister is helping too. And I'm not going anywhere either, Emily added. If you want me around. As my daughter hugged her tightly, Emily looked in my direction, and I noticed her eyes sparkle. She had wanted children with her previous husband, but for some reason, it never happened. We like you, Emily, my son said with a smirk, and we know you make Daddy happy too. He's smiling again. My son made me blush. Emily smiled at me, the kind of smile a woman uses to let a man know how she feels. A few months passed rather quickly, and our lives changed. I built an addition to the house and turned it into my private area. It was a bedroom, office, and living space all in one. The kids loved it as we could all play together. When I worked from home, my kids enjoyed sitting on the couch and keeping me company. And when Emily came to visit, we had our own personal space while the kids were in the other living room. I rarely saw my wife, avoided her when she was home, and the only communication now was solely through texts. I had no idea what she did for a living and found that I didn't care at all. A portion of her paycheck still went into a joint account, so all bills were covered. I slowly began to remove her from my life so that she would no longer be a beneficiary in things like life insurance. This will only benefit my children. The same goes for probate, as I intended to be divorced by the time I died. Emily stayed the night with us, although we did not become intimate. but she would happily walk through the front door on Friday night and only leave when she was going to work on Monday morning. We even slept in the same bed, but she realized I wasn't ready. I still wore the ring, as although our marriage was a joke, I still considered myself married and a husband. Thankfully, Emily didn't pressure me or rush me. She liked to just hold me in her arms, whispering that she loved me and that she would wait as long as I needed. Honestly, she's a fool, she whispered one night. She has no idea what she's thrown away. And you still have to go on dates. I'm a patient woman, Mark. Louise. I confess that, having been let off the leash, I guess I went a little crazy. I had always been a faithful wife and mother, but I had given almost 20 years of my life to my family. It was time to live a little of my own life. I felt it was due to me for sacrificing so much. Yes, I can hear you now saying that my husband did the same thing. Well, he was in an open relationship too, and he could take advantage of that. Whether or not he takes advantage of it is up to him. The simple fact is, he agreed to it. He could have said no. And while we could have argued, I would have understood his reasons and agreed in the end. I might have been a little annoyed, but deep down I know I would never cheat on him. But like I said, I guess I did go a little crazy. Then there were the Tinder dates. Not all of them were successful, but there were plenty of young men ready and willing to take me to a hotel room. Time flew by quickly as I burned at both ends of the candle. Weekend hikes quickly turned into 1 or 2 nights a week. I didn't forget about my family. I made sure my portion of the bills were paid and kept in touch with the kids. I didn't get much socialization from my husband, and whenever I was home, he avoided me like the plague. When I had a quiet moment and thought about it, I remembered the last time we slept in the same bed or had a deep and meaningful conversation. And though I was determined to change that, I would soon be distracted by the suggestion that we go out for the evening. Then, it wasn't until I returned home to spend the weekend with my kids and maybe even my husband that I realized how much had changed and how much I had actually missed out on in the last few months of getting what I wanted. Knowing that my husband wasn't happy with me, I usually kept to the living room, kitchen, and bedroom because trying to talk to him was like talking to a brick wall. The only topic he discussed was our children. The state of our marriage? He just looked at me like I was a complete idiot. Even so, I missed him. I missed our kids. Part of me wanted to quietly end it all, but there was also a part of me that was having too much fun to end it all. There were too many young men who were interested in a woman my age. "Hi!" I exclaimed as I walked through the front door. "I'm home!" The lights were on, but no one called my name. Dropping my purse on a chair, I walked to the kitchen where I found my husband and 2 children sitting down to dinner. The surprise was that Emily was there. I knew her well, as she had been friends with my husband since they were children. As I approached my husband, I stopped, meeting his gaze. I knew he was still not happy, but figured his feelings must have thawed. I quickly realized that wasn't the case. In fact, he was looking at me like I was nothing more than dirt on his shoe. "What are you doing here?" our daughter finally asked. Her tone spoke volumes. "What do you mean?" "I'm here to spend time with my family." She scoffed at that suggestion, meeting my eyes and smirking as if she knew something I didn't. As for our son, he looked at me, practically grinning, and then turned and addressed Emily. "Is there room for me?" I asked my husband. "No," he replied. That was all he said, his voice expressing no emotion. Then I looked around and noticed the change. When I returned to the living room, it looked more like a museum than a place to live. The kitchen had been painted, and the pictures that once hung on the walls had been removed. Looking closer, I discovered that there are no pictures of my husband and me. There are a couple of us with our children, but our wedding photo that once held a place of honor is no longer there. Looking around our bedroom, I realized that my husband hadn't used this room in a while. Back in the kitchen, I noticed a significant difference. Distracted by everything else that was going on in my life, I just didn't pay attention to it. Walking over to the double doors, I opened them and saw what appeared to be a huge living space with a sleeping area, a couple of nice couches, and a large entertainment area. "What is this?" I asked. "My part of the house," Mark replied. Again, there was nothing special in his tone, just a statement of fact. "And why did you build it? Why didn't you tell me?" He just looked at me, remaining silent, but his eyes spoke volumes. I glanced at my kids and they both smirked. The only one who remained silent, not giving anything away, was Emily. But I noticed she was holding his hand under the table. "Why are you here, Mom?" our daughter finally asked. "Aren't you supposed to be on a date with one of your boyfriends?" I turned to my husband. "Do they know? Did you tell the kids about our arrangement? They've been asking where you've been all these months." I told them, I'm not going to lie to our kids to cover for you. It was your decision. You've hardly been home for a couple months anyway, our son added. I'm surprised you're even here. Why are you here? Our daughter asked again. We were having a nice dinner until you showed up and made it awkward. I looked at my husband. Are you going to fix our kids' attitudes, Mark? No, he answered without even looking in my direction, turning to look at Emily, who was silent but clearly watching with interest. Our kids are teenagers and entitled to their opinions. Do you even know how old they are? You missed my birthday, our daughter declared. And you missed my team playing and winning the grand final, our son added. They finished eating and Emily, without saying a word, stood up and motioned for them to go to the other room so I could talk to my husband. I'm pretty sure I stood there opening and closing my mouth as Mark got up and pulled a beer out of the fridge. Leaning his back against the counter, he sipped his beer for a minute or two before he finally asked, Why are you here, Louise? I wanted to spend time with my family this weekend. My kids and my husband. He looked away for a few seconds, then nodded. Good luck with that. I'm busy tonight and this weekend. As for the kids, well, you can always ask them. I was hoping. He stopped and turned to face me. Remember the agreements, Louise. I have no idea what you're doing now, and I don't care anymore. I didn't care the day you made me agree to this. But you can try to talk to our kids if you want. But I wouldn't hold my breath. After 5 minutes of talking to both of them, I realized that neither of them wanted anything to do with me this evening or weekend. Sighing in defeat, I went back to the bedroom and felt alone in my own house. Okay, I muttered. If that's the way it is, I can just leave. I'll see you later. Probably not, our daughter replied sarcastically. I grabbed my bag and hurried out of the house into my car. Slamming the door, I slammed my palms on the steering wheel a few times, feeling utterly stupid and unable to stop the tears that flowed as I found myself blaming everything on my husband, until I remembered the look in his eyes the night I'd approached him with my request, and the same eyes the night I'd come home from our first date. But it was the look in his eyes that night that had chilled me. There was absolutely nothing for me now. No love. But there was no hate either. Just total indifference. I was almost a stranger to him now. As I leaned back in my seat, I could only wonder if I had ruined everything that really mattered to me. Had he been right in the first place? Had my girlfriends really steered me down the garden path? Maybe their husbands would have tolerated such an arrangement, but Mark had always been a proud man. Then I remembered part of our agreement, and everything suddenly made sense, making me cry even harder. He had completely disconnected from me. According to him, we were only married out of convenience, and I suddenly doubted we would ever go back to the way things were. I knew I couldn't go to my friends because, frankly, I would end up blaming them for the collapse of my marriage. Wheeling aimlessly around town, I eventually parked at a bar I knew well. Once inside, I sat down and ordered a drink, which soon turned into 2 and 3 as I struggled to hold back tears. Is this seat taken? A kind voice asked, and I saw the man looking at me. No, it's not taken, I replied, snorting a couple times. Though I'm not sure I'd be good company. Maybe you need some company. It's not nice to see a woman sitting alone, looking lonely and frustrated. He sat back in his chair, bought himself a drink, and offered to buy me a drink. As soon as the glass was in front of me, he raised his glass to clink. Need someone else's ear to talk about it? I'm not sure you'd want to hear my story. Is it that bad? The more I sit here and think about it, the more I wonder if I've ruined everything. He held out his hand. I'm Tom. And you are? Looking at his hand, I finally took it. I'm Louise. And now we're no longer strangers. I am now a friendly ear. And a beautiful woman like you crying alone in a bar suggests that something or someone has broken your heart. Are you sure you want to hear about this? I'm in no hurry to go anywhere. Taking a deep breath, I turned to him and looked at him carefully. I thought he was incredibly handsome, but unlike all my other lovers, he was older than me, perhaps even closer to 50. I told him in general terms what was going on, and except for 1 or 2 questions, he usually just nodded his head in understanding. When I finished my story, he ordered another drink for us. I suppose the question is about wanting to maintain a relationship, Louise. Honestly, I can do that at the moment, as I'm not sure my husband will ever find it in himself to get our relationship back on track. He's just angry with me all the time. But he agreed to it, hasn't discussed it with you since, and just lets his anger and resentment build up. How can you fix anything if he won't talk to you? I just want my husband to love me again, I whispered. All these other men don't love me. It's just a pleasant pastime. I don't expect much from them. After another round of drinks, I was in no condition to drive. Tom asked where I would sleep that night. After suggesting I get a hotel since I didn't really want to drive home, he asked if I could ride home with him. I live alone and have spare bedrooms, he added. I don't expect anything different, Louise. I immediately agreed. Tom called a cab to pick us up, and I headed to my car to grab the overnight bag I always carried with me. He lived on the opposite end of town from where I lived with my family. Taking me inside, he showed me around first, including the bedroom I would call my own that night. Asking if I wanted a nightcap, I agreed, and we had a glass of something strong while sitting next to each other on the couch. You're a beautiful woman, Louise, he said softly, putting his hand on my thigh. Did you ever think that instead of numerous lovers, you'd find one or two that would make you feel as special as you deserve? I don't want to fall in love with someone else, I replied softly. You know you can love more than one person, he replied. I met his gaze and couldn't help but smile, for he was very handsome. The best part was that he was nothing like my husband. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, Louise. You know almost nothing about me. Waking up the next morning, I put on spare clothes and met him in the kitchen. After greeting me with a kiss on the cheek, we ate breakfast at the counter, getting to know each other. What I in no way expected to hear was that he was in the same relationship as me. I'm always honest with any woman I meet. I don't wear a wedding ring when my wife isn't with me because it's usually annoying, but I always tell the woman before we sleep together. My wife lives elsewhere and we only see each other once a month. Do you have children? They're grown and moved away from home where they go to school. The rest of the time they live with my wife. Do you have many mistresses? In the early days of our open relationship, I, by my own admission, slept with any woman who showed the slightest interest in me. Now that I'm older and wiser, I prefer to have a real relationship. Sipping his coffee, he finally asked, What are your plans for the weekend, Louise? I don't have any at the moment. Would you like to spend them with me? He leaned forward and took my hand. You are an attractive woman, Louise, and I confess that I sat next to you last night for two reasons. The first is that I saw a beautiful woman who was incredibly upset, and I wanted to comfort her. The second reason is that I wanted to get to know this beautiful woman better and generally hoped she would take an interest in me in return. I squeezed his hand in return and felt a smile appear on my face. I think you've come to the right place, Tom. I'd love to spend the weekend with you. The thought never left me that Tom was what we would call well-to-do. The house he lived in must have cost a fortune. His luxury car was something my husband and I could never afford, even with 2 paychecks. And after our day together, the restaurant he took me to was one of the best in town, and it was obvious he was trying to set me up for wine and dinner. Afterward, he asked me to dance, and I probably didn't surprise him too much by kissing him first. It made him smile looking into my eyes. We danced until late in the evening, until he asked if I was ready to go. He held my hand until we were in the back of the cab, and I snuggled up against him and his arm wrapped around me in return. Arriving home after midnight, he offered me a drink while I took off my shoes and waited for him in the living room. We sipped our drinks, talking quietly, and then I made up my mind and leaned in to kiss him. We ended up in his bedroom. Sunday at breakfast, Tom gave me a thought. My marriage to my husband would be difficult. He explained where I was wrong. He and his wife didn't force things. They were spending more time living apart, so opening up the marriage made sense in a way. I surprised my husband with a request, and then practically forced him to say yes. Although the relationship would be difficult, he insisted that I do everything I could to repair the damaged relationship with my children. At first, our children didn't understand, especially when I moved my business elsewhere, and that meant I would only visit them occasionally. However, I only did this when they were old enough. It sounds like your children were told about the situation, so now it's up to you to figure out how it works. He took my hand and smiled. And do your best to mend your relationship with Mark. He seems like a good man. He's a wonderful man. Almost as wonderful as your wife. I love my wife and plan to retire with her sooner rather than later. The day I come home will be the day this all ends. What does she think? She misses her husband, but I also know that she keeps 2 lovers while I'm not around. When I'm around, all her attention is focused on me. I do the same when she visits me here. Things seem to be working out for you two? Not without problems, but we make sure there's no jealousy or resentment. I spent most of the afternoon with him before he drove me back to the bar where my car was parked. When he put his arm around me, I couldn't help but sigh. Maybe I was going about this all wrong. A one-night stand is fun for a while, but emotionally he was leaving a void in me. And now I had somehow found a decent, good-hearted man who was interested in me. Hell, He'd even given me advice that sounded like solid advice on how it might work in my own marriage. All you can do is keep in touch with your husband. Do your best to do that, he said. But the most important thing right now is your children. Do everything you can to rebuild that relationship. I'll do my best. When can we see each other again? As soon as you want to. Like I said, I'm not seeing anyone else and I don't plan to. But I need your promise that you won't be jealous if I meet someone else. I can get myself another semi-permanent boyfriend. He laughed, and I was surprised at how much I liked the sound. Now you're thinking right, Louise. You've had your fun, and that's perfectly fine. But I think you've now realized that you need something more serious, perhaps more permanent, perhaps lovers who will focus on the first 4 letters of the word. I hugged him tightly. I'll call you soon, I said. I'm looking forward to it, Louise. I watched him drive away before getting into my car. Taking a deep breath, I slowly drove home, going over in my head what I should do and say to my family. On the way, I stopped to pick up most of my things from my friends. Janet was intrigued, and I told her that I was going to stop the constant weeknight outings, that I was done with the meaningless fun, that if I was going to do this, I needed a real relationship. Janet seemed ready to argue, but I hugged her, letting her know that she was still my best friend, and I loved her. Good luck, she told me at the front door. By the time I entered the house, it was late evening. Going upstairs, I gathered my clothes and headed into the kitchen. I heard a noise coming from the other end of the house, from the door to my husband's room. I had to stop and hold back my sobs as the phrase rang through my head. My husband had taken every possible step to separate our lives, except for actually finalizing the divorce. Our son, Matthew, played on a console that looked like a video game console, and the new TV was huge, mounted to the wall. Our daughter, Zara, was happily studying next to her brother, oblivious to the noise of the gaming system. If you looked out the windows, my husband was standing on the new terrace, hugging a woman. And it didn't look like Emily. Clearing his throat, Matthew looked in my direction and was surprised to see me. Facing his sister, she pulled her headphones out of her ears, ready to yell at him, but he gestured at me. Walking over to the kids, I sat down on my knees between them, taking their hands in mine. Before I could stop myself, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. Please don't ever doubt that I am your mother, and I love you, I managed to say. I know you know everything, and I'm sorry I missed some things. I promise I will behave better from now on. My son had always been closer to me than my daughter. When his lower lip began to quiver, I turned to hug him tightly. I don't understand, Mom, he finally said. Why are you gone all the time? It broke my heart, and part of me realized that I should have stopped then and there. I'm sorry, baby. I didn't mean it. I miss you, that's all. I'll try to be better from now on. Are you really with other men? Let's not talk about that, Matthew. That's something your father and I have to worry about. Pulling away, I kissed each of his cheeks and then ruffled his hair. I know I need to work with you, Matthew. I promise I'll try to attend all the home games next season if I can. I can send you a calendar of our matches when it comes out. When I turned to my daughter, she didn't look so convinced anymore. She was older than her brother. She had her own views and ideas about life, and she'd always been the apple of my husband's eye. You broke Daddy's hearts, Mom, she declared not too kindly. What a wife. You're too young to understand. She stood up, the books in her lap falling to the floor, and she stared at me. I'm not too young to understand, Mother, she shouted, contempt so evident in her tone. I'm 16, almost 17 years old. You think I don't read stuff on the internet and magazines? What happens in your father and I's marriage stays between the two of us. But your behavior and decisions affect me. And on my daddy. She then burst into tears and ran away. Sighing and backing away, I didn't even hear Mark walk in until I felt his presence looming over me. Looking into his eyes, I felt the familiar coldness. Are you staying for dinner, Louise? Nodding, I managed to answer. I'll try to be here more often, Mark. Is this your wife, Mark? A kind voice asked. And as I turned around, I saw an absolutely gorgeous woman walking towards him. And what immediately set me off was that she was no more than 25. When she smiled at me, trying to appear innocent, I almost stood up to strangle the bitch. I'm Cindy. What about no visitors, Mark? She's here for the afternoon to keep me company, and then she's going home after dinner. Not that you have the right to tell me what to do, Louise. We have a free relationship, remember? I'm just exercising my rights as a free man, enjoying the company of many beautiful women. I had nothing to reply to that. But admittedly, I felt annoyed and jealous as I watched my husband and daughter prepare dinner together. Cindy sipped wine from her glass, watching with a smile on her face, and I read her gaze as she watched my husband. As for my daughter, she had always been close to her father, but it felt like they had gotten even closer in the last few months. But he was gracious enough to secure a seat for me at the table, even though I sat on the other end from him, seating me closest to my son, who, though clearly upset with me, at least struck up a conversation with me. Mark didn't say a word to me, continuing his conversation with Cindy and Zara. My presence was simply ignored. However, he didn't lie. An hour after finishing dinner and cleaning up, he walked Cindy to her car. He waved and waited until her car was out of sight, then walked out the front door. "Mark," I said quietly. He stopped and looked at me, this time without anger. Nor was there the coldness I'd come to expect. He wasn't smiling, but I could sense that my husband was happy. "Can we talk, Mark?" He sighed and ran his hand over his face. "About what, Louise?" he finally asked back, and there was a weariness in his tone that I hadn't expected. "About us, Mark. I'm still your wife. You're still my husband. I still love you. I never wanted any of this to happen." I thought he was going to explode with rage again, as I noticed his fists clenching more than once. Finally, he walked over to one of the chairs and sat down. "You wanted an open relationship, Louise. I accepted your demands. You accepted my demands. When was the last time we slept in the same bed? Didn't share a bed with my wife after she dated other men. Remember what I said. No emotional support, no physical support, no love and affection. If you want all that, find someone else. This is what you wanted, Louise. I never wanted my wife to leave to be with someone else. I was happily married. Now I'm married in name only, as far as I'm concerned." "Who is she?" I had to ask. "You brought another woman into our home." "We never did anything here," he stated bluntly. "And who she is none of your business. I don't care who you're with, and who I'm with is none of your business." He stood up and looked at me, almost with pity in his eyes. "Everything that has happened is a consequence of your decisions, Louise. I warned you of what would happen. I have many idioms I can think of about all of this. Perhaps one of them is, be careful what you wish for. You got what you wanted from me, but you didn't care about how it would affect everyone in our family." I was watching TV in the living room when my son appeared in the doorway. He looked a little unsure until I patted the empty seat next to me. I couldn't help but smile at how tall he already was, and turned to lean against him when he finally sat down. "Do you miss your mom?" "Yeah." I knew I wouldn't be sleeping with my husband this night. Matthew went to bed at a reasonable time. Turning off the lights throughout the house, I walked over to the double doors that led to Mark's part of the house. One of the doors was closed, the other left ajar. He was lying on the couch with our daughter pressed against him, his arms around her, and I could see her body trembling. It was obvious she was crying, and I knew I was the cause of it. If I walked in, I knew things would get ugly, and words would fly that couldn't be taken back. Sighing, I quietly closed the door and headed for my bedroom. There was no point in calling it our bedroom anymore. I wasn't sure my husband would ever return to it. Mark. I took Emily's advice to heart and decided that if my wife could go out and have fun, there was nothing stopping me from doing the same. And I realized very quickly that there were a lot of young women who would be interested in a 40-year-old man who was successful in his business, had his own house and car, had raised a couple of good kids, and, I thought, was somewhat good-looking. Friends and coworkers set me up with girls and women they knew pretty quickly. I didn't want to date anyone too young. Cindy was 25, and she was so cute, I couldn't say no to her. Charlotte was 28, a high-flying career woman who craved love and companionship, but only on her own terms and in her own time. Melissa was in her early 30s, worked as a lawyer for a company we did regular business with, and was an absolute dynamo in bed, doing things for me that my wife had long since stopped doing or never did for me. And then there was Jessica. Don't shoot me, but she's only 21 years old, even though she's the daughter of a female coworker. Both were aware of my situation. Jessica had had her heart broken by some pretty shitty boyfriends, so after explaining the situation, Jessica happily agreed to be one of my friends. "I'm partial to handsome older men," she told me during our first date. "Mark, can I be honest about one thing?" "Sure." "Your wife is a goddamn idiot." "You're not my only girlfriend who says that. The only thing that surprises me is that it somehow works. I don't mean with my wife. I mean between me and you and the rest of you. Oh, I'm jealous when I know you're seeing someone else." But I went into this arrangement with my eyes wide open, realizing that it wasn't forever. but that I would be spending time with someone who would make me feel special every time we were together. Besides, we all know about Emily and her due date. I was told she extended it. Yeah, she said I now have a year to have fun. No. Did you ever think she was afraid to make the move to be with you permanently? All the time. The thing is, we're very much in love. Pretty much our whole lives. But our love has always been platonic. So what you're saying is that you really need to take her to bed, make love to her like no one else, so that she realizes that deep down, you both need to be together. How can you be so young and yet so wise? She clapped me playfully on the shoulder. All your girlfriends say it's a good idea, and we all love Emily so much. She's too charming and understanding. We all agree that you two are right for each other. Sighing, Jessica clung to me even tighter. Don't feel guilty because it's not just up to you, Mark. Sometimes a woman just has to let you know she wants you more than anything else in the world. Waking up in the morning, we got dressed, went down to the lobby and had breakfast, and then went back to the room to pack, after which I drove us home. After dropping her off at her house, I got out of the car and walked her to the door, sharing one long, lingering kiss with her, after which she headed inside, turning around with a dreamy smile on her face. I knew I'd hear about it at work the next day. Arriving home a little after stopping by the store, Matthew took his usual seat in front of the TV, and I could hear him yelling into the speaker of the headset he was wearing. Zara was sitting at the table, busy minding her own business as usual. Kissing the top of her head, she turned her around so I could leave a kiss on her cheek. Have you two been okay the last 2 nights? I'm 16, Daddy. I'm quite capable of taking care of myself on my own. And your brother? He hasn't been too intrusive, if that's what you're asking. Any sign of your mother? Not since Wednesday night. Fair enough. What do you want for dinner? The 3 of us enjoyed dinner, though Matthew sat down at the table and gorged himself on his portion with gusto before returning to his game. Zara grinned at me, shaking her head as we cleaned up the kitchen together. Grabbing a beer from the fridge, I headed out onto the deck to enjoy the last rays of sunshine. Zara came out to join me and ended up settling on my lap. Daddy, are you happy? Depends on how you define it and what I'd be happy about. Am I happy with you? I tickled her, making her squirm and squeal for a few seconds. Yes, happy. I love my children and would do anything for them, as I'm sure you know. Am I happy with my current situation? Honestly, no. I feel like I'm treading water. Am I happy with my personal life in regards to anything other than your mother? I'm not going to lie, yes. At the moment, I'm quite content. I think Mom has a boyfriend. I mean, someone she's seeing on a regular basis now. Good for her. You really don't care, do you? No, honey. We're living completely separate lives now. The only thing we have in common now is you, 2 kids, some of our finances, this house, and a piece of paper that says we're husband and wife. Sighing to myself, I added, you two were never meant to be involved in this. That's what I assumed anyway. But I figured your mother's frequent disappearances would always be noticed, and I wasn't about to lie on her behalf. The thing is, I tried my best not to do the same thing, but after a while it started to seem like she was going out of her way to flaunt it, almost insinuating that she could go and do it, and I couldn't. I think you've met some beautiful women, Dad. Yes, I have 4 beautiful women to spend time with. They all know I'm married, but it's out in the open. They all know it's not forever. They all know I'm not going to fall in love and leave my marriage for one of them. Because of Emily, Zara whispered. Daddy, are you in love with her? She rarely called me Daddy now, only when she wanted to say something. Pulling her tighter against me, resting her head against my shoulder, I pondered the question. She's my best friend, Zara. She's been by my side longer than anyone else I've ever known. I've helped her through more than one relationship breakup. Broke the nose of an ex-boyfriend who was mean to her. Beat the shit out of a guy who thought cheating on her was a good idea. Sounds like love, Daddy. Your mother made my decision by taking love for granted. Emily never did that. We've never been in a relationship together. Never been intimate. But there's one person on this planet I can rely on more than anyone else, and that's her. Your mother knew that too. I know that Emily warned her that if she broke my heart, she would be the one who would have to repair the shards, and that she might just make up her mind and want to be with me. But in the meantime, are you having fun? Emily is more than aware of everything I do. Hell, she even encourages me. That's what friends are for, Dad. But I'll be thrilled when you marry her. Wait, what? Did she say something? No, but you deserve to be happy, and Mom hasn't done that since the day she made the request. Are you going to divorce her anytime soon? No, there's no need for that. She lives her life, I live mine. When you two children leave home, then I will make sure we divorce as soon as possible. Emily arrived at our house Tuesday night, and if I didn't know any better, my daughter was busy playing matchmaker the whole time. My son was a little oblivious, but I cast reproachful glances at my daughter more than once during and after the meal. By the time they went to bed, Emily snuggled up against me, wrapped her arm around my waist, and sat in cozy silence. It went on like that until she started giggling. Your daughter wasn't elusive today, Mark, she whispered. No, but we've been talking a lot lately. She wants us to get married. Emily pressed herself against me so that my arm was wrapped tightly around her. And what do you think of that idea? We need to get a divorce first. Do you love me, Mark? The only people I love more are my children. And Louise? I don't love her anymore, Emily. So, apart from your children, you love me the most? There was a time when I loved Louise more. That goes without saying. I dated her. I married her. Heck, you supported our relationship and made sure our wedding day was a success. We had kids, raised them, built a house together, and now here we are. Have you ever wondered? She hesitated, but I knew what the question would be. Not while I was married, no, because I didn't allow myself to. Plus, you were my best friend, if you don't count my wife. I was a happily married man. And now? I think about it a lot. The one thing I can always be grateful to Louise for is that I'm a father and have two wonderful children. That night, Emily stayed with me. Nothing physical happened, as I don't think either of us were ready. My daughter was thrilled to have Emily with us at breakfast the next morning. My son didn't seem to be that bothered. I knew he interacted with his mother much more often than his sister. He told me about the apology and promise his mother had made a couple of months ago. Since then, she has started showing up at the house a little more often. He also informed me that his mother had invited him over for dinner, a standing invitation for her daughter that was never accepted. Walking Emily to the car mid-morning, she said, I'd like to stay the night again. I think it's fine for me because we don't have sex. That's one of the rules, right? Yes, and I'm sticking to it too. Louise came home on Wednesday. I could see she was looking forward to the four of us sitting down to a family dinner for the first time in months. Too bad for her that I had a date planned with Cindy. To my surprise, she stood up and begged me to stay as I walked to the front door. I turned around and returned her a neutral look. Please stay, Mark. We didn't have... It's not my fault, Louise. But we can. I have plans for tonight. Our children knew about it. They didn't expect me to have dinner with them tonight. They also knew that I might not be home and that I would see them tomorrow after school. Can't you stay, please? For me? I glared at her, then turned and walked out the door. I knew Cindy was waiting for me at the nearest pub. Of course, I wasn't going to tell my wife about it. She didn't need to know, and it was none of her business. Louise. He hates me, I muttered, snuggling up to Tom. Now I slept at home alone whenever I was there. I enjoyed these moments with Tom, usually up to 3 times a week. I hadn't found a second steady lover yet, but I wasn't sleeping as often anymore. I think it's over, Tom. Do you have any idea what he's doing? I couldn't hold back the chuckle that escaped me. Oh, my daughter takes great pleasure in telling me about all the women he apparently dates, and she bluntly told me that she hopes he divorces me and marries Emily. To his best friend? Yes. And these other women? They've been visiting the house since Mark likes to cook them dinner. Apparently, he's become quite good in the kitchen. He used to cook for me, but our daughter... I take it she's not happy with you? Frankly, I think she takes great pleasure in the collapse of our marriage. She blames me for everything. Daddy's little girl? I waited a few seconds to get my emotions under control. I broke his heart, Tom. He's completely shut me out, but our daughter obviously knows what he's thinking and feeling. So what are you going to do? To be honest, I think my daughter is right. I don't know how I'm going to save our marriage because Mark still won't sit down and talk to me. The only thing he and I talk about is either the kids or something to do with our finances. I send him texts all the time about how much I miss him and love him, but I get nothing in return. I don't even try to call him because I know he won't answer. Tom made me feel better by making love to me. If I couldn't get my husband back, Tom was someone I enjoyed spending time with. There was another man, Daniel, who was interested in me. He was about the same age as my husband, single himself, but unsure of a relationship with a married woman, despite my assurances that my marriage was probably a failure. I loved spending time with Tom, as he always made me feel special. He took me on dates. We would spend entire weekends together. We could sit for hours and talk about any topic that came to mind. We tried not to talk about our other partners, but since they were an important part of our lives, they would slip into the conversation from time to time. A few months later, we were lying in bed. I want to ask one question. Anything, Tom. How would you feel about starting to go on trips with me? I do business all the time in the States and in Europe. With a beautiful woman under my arm, I won't be so lonely. What about your wife? He grinned to himself. Too busy to join me in such matters. And I want you to come with me, Louise. I met his gaze before asking, Really? I love spending time with you and I'd like you to keep me company while I'm gone. How long will I be gone? A couple weeks to a month. Depends on what kind of deals I'm trying to make. I'll need to tell the kids at least. Of course. I realize my request will affect your ability to spend time with them. But I know your daughter is 17 now, and your son is 15. How was her birthday? Awkward as hell. Both families are obviously already aware of it. I thought she didn't want me there, but I have a feeling Mark insisted on my presence. Maybe it's a small sign that somewhere deep inside there's still love. He knows my relationship with my daughter is broken, but he knows our son still loves me. I hear from him almost every day and try to call him every night if I'm not home. When do you need to know? As soon as you can. I'm leaving for the States on Thursday. On Monday, coming home, we found no sign of any other guests. Mark was preparing dinner with Zara, and both looked in my direction when I appeared in the doorway. Are you here for dinner? Asked Mark. Yes, do you mind? Of course. It's still your house, Louise. I almost cried. It was probably the nicest thing he'd said to me since the day I'd approached him with this request. Matthew noticed me from his spot on the couch in my father's room, came out and hugged me. I almost gasped, for he was still growing taller. Soon he would be as tall as his father, though not quite wide yet. For the first time ever, the four of us sat down to dinner. We didn't talk much, but I couldn't stop smiling as I looked at my husband. I would call him that until the day we divorced, and part of me still hoped that we would somehow manage to save our marriage. When dinner was finished, Mark served dessert. Just ice cream with chocolate sauce, but everyone at the table relaxed. I knew I would ruin the mood with my words. Mark, I know you don't want to hear anything about my business, but Tom has made a request of me, and it is that I won't be around for a couple weeks to a month. If it affects our children, I'll hear, Louise. He is a businessman, and he has asked me to accompany him on business trips in the future. His wife lives elsewhere and doesn't want to go, so he asked if I wanted to go with him. It means I won't be here as often as I'd like, but... It's okay, Mom, Matthew said. Where will you go? He mentioned traveling to the United States and Europe. Zara said nothing and kept an impassive expression on her face. I figured she didn't care one way or the other. Then I looked at Mark. He was looking at me, and I couldn't understand him either, until he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Do you love him? I love you, Mark, I answered quietly. No matter what, I'm still your wife and you're still my husband. I didn't ask that, Louise. I asked, do you love him? I don't know. I enjoy his company. I looked away for a moment before looking at him again. And do you love everyone you're with? He stared at me for a few seconds before he just smirked and got to his feet to gather up all of our bowls and dishes. Zara got up to help her father clean up, realizing that I wasn't going to get a response from him and any conversation was over. I retired to the living room, feeling somewhat relieved that Matthew had come to keep me company. Later that evening, I was already in bed when the bedroom door opened, and soon a warm body enveloped me in its embrace. It wasn't until a few seconds later that I realized it wasn't my husband. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. Turning around, I hugged him tightly and burst into tears. No doubt my son wasn't ready for his mother to fall apart. But he stroked my back and whispered that I was his mother, and that he loved me no matter what. That made me feel better, and I snuggled up to him. Thank you, baby, I whispered. I spent the next 2 nights at home before heading out with Tom on our first trip together. Mark and Zara were as polite as they could be, but otherwise ignored my presence unless they were in the same room. Matthew was quite affectionate, seeming to realize that I was feeling rather lonely. I knew he wasn't offended by his father or sister realizing what was going on, so I did my best to explain things to him. Dad always insisted that we should keep in touch with you, he told me, and that made me smile. He may not have loved me, but he knew I would always love our children. I had already made arrangements at work to work remotely while I was away, so I packed my things Thursday morning for Tom to pick me up from home. When I got downstairs, Mark had already left for work, and only the kids were still sitting at the table eating breakfast before heading off to university and school. Zara barely said 2 words to me, which I expected and tried to ignore. I did get up as she was leaving and asked if I could give my daughter a hug. There must have been something in my tone because she softened a little and hugged me for a few seconds. I really love you, Zara, I whispered. You are my firstborn. She let go of me, and without meeting my gaze, she murmured that she hoped I had a good time before disappearing out the door. I was the last to leave. Matthew hugged me, asked me to take lots of pictures if I was sightseeing, and only then walked out the door. A few minutes later, Tom came to pick me up. Over the next few months, I went away with Tom more often than I expected. We traveled to North and South America, parts of Asia, and spent a lot of time in Europe. While he was working, we did some sightseeing, and he also made sure that I hardly had to pay for anything. I was always introduced as his partner or girlfriend. Whether the people we dated knew he had a wife, I didn't know and certainly didn't ask. I also knew I had a crush on him. He was incredibly romantic and generous. One day while I was away, I was checking social media and realized what I had been missing otherwise. Mark didn't block me and used them primarily to let his family and friends know what he was up to. When a news story came out about him taking the kids away on vacation to New Zealand, I didn't know whether to be angry or upset. Most of the pictures showed the kids having a great time. Mark never once mentioned it to me when I was home. Neither did either of the kids. The fact that Matthew didn't mention it hurt me the most. I didn't miss the fact that Emily showed up in a lot of the pictures too. After lunch, Tom came back to our room and found me crying on the bed. He didn't ask what was wrong, but just joined me, taking off his shoes and hugging me. Taking my phone, he checked to see what had me so upset and then kissed me. I feel like I should take some of the blame, he said. You're spending a lot of time with me right now. I just feel like I'm already divorced and he's just dealing with the kids on his own time. Maybe you want to stop traveling with me for a while? Maybe we could, I don't know, spend some time at home and you could get to know the kids? Are you sure about that, Louise? I met his gaze as he smiled at me. I'm just asking because... He sighed and kissed my forehead. I really love you, Louise. That made me smile. We had expressed our love for each other on our first trip. But I still love my wife and I can't imagine a time when I will leave her. Introducing your children to me would be... I'm not sure, to be honest. I wouldn't want to inflate expectations. After coming home a week later, I tried to spend as much time in our house as possible, as well as socializing with Tom. Trying to corner Mark was quite difficult as he always seemed to know where I was. But one evening when he was home alone, I did get through to him. You've gone to New Zealand with the kids, I asked. Why? I decided to give our kids a vacation. They haven't gone on vacation in years. Why did you exclude me? Because you were with your boyfriend at the time, he replied with a shrug. I would have canceled. He turned to look at me. I'm not going to pretend to be a happy family to fulfill your needs, Louise. I wanted to take our children on vacation. You're too busy jetting around the world with your boyfriend. And it just so happens that Emily came with you? Emily is my best friend. She's been my anchor and support from day one of this bullshit arrangement you insisted on. I invited her over for company while the kids had fun. What about Christmas? What about it? Are you planning anything? Am I going to be involved? That's entirely up to you, Louise. Mark, if you just talk to me. His eyes turned to ice as he stared at me, and I knew his body language well. He was on the verge of exploding. I had never made my husband angry until the night he was asked. Sure, maybe I was constantly annoying him about little things, but anger? He had never once raised his voice in my direction, even for a second. We have nothing to talk about from the night you made your request, and the next night when I was practically forced to agree. You've made your thoughts and feelings about our marriage perfectly clear, Louise. I miss you, Mark. I want my husband to be with me. I can't remember the last time we did anything together. I can't remember the last time we shared a bed and made love. And it's your fault, Louise. I refuse to sleep and be intimate with a wife who wants to share herself with other men. But you agreed to it. He looked at me and started chuckling, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? I never wanted anything like that. I wanted my wife to stay faithful to me. But no, you just had to go out and have fun. Go and entertain a few other men. By doing that, Louise, you gave up virtually all privileges regarding my role in the marriage. Either I agreed to an open marriage, or my wife would unravel and go and cheat on me. Either way, I would lose. I would never cheat on you, Mark. No, you would. You were so eager to have fun with other guys that I know you had at least one man in mind when you made your request. Don't take me for a fool, Louise. You're sleeping with another woman too, Mark. Don't make it all about me. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. I wasn't going to just mope around the house while you had fun with everyone else. He took a step toward me, and his anger melted away. I know it was your goddamn slut girlfriend Janet who put all that nonsense in your head. Are you aware of what's been going on with her lately? Her husband finally kicked her whore ass to the curb. I learned a lot from him. She's been out partying her ass off. And he had to stay home and take care of the kids and practically be a cuckold. Do you know she started bringing men home and having fun with them while he was in the house? I felt my jaw drop. I had barely spoken to Janet in months, but I had never expected her to be so disrespectful to her own husband. I hadn't heard from any of the other friends I'd met at all. But I also remembered what I'd been told before all of this started, that they go out and have fun, and husbands. My head dropped as I realized that Mark had guessed everything, and probably from the beginning. I don't know exactly what they would say, Louise, he said, and the anger in his voice was gone. There was just no emotion in it now. But I can make a few guesses, and I know I hit the mark most of the time. You took the word of a few whores, and with your request, you destroyed our marriage, our home, and everything that made our union so special. And there's no going back to what we once had. He stepped forward again. Why is that, Louise? You never explained why. Was I a bad husband? Was I a bad lover? Did I make you unhappy? If you wanted a divorce? I was bored. Not good enough, Louise. Boredom is no reason to tell your husband you want to have fun with other men. Try again. I met his gaze, his figure blurring slightly as my eyes filled with tears. The problem was that I still couldn't explain it, at least not without destroying what was left of our marriage. I'd had plenty of time to realize that I'd made an incredibly selfish request, forced him into an arrangement he didn't like, and listened to bad advice from friends who I should have realized didn't have the best intentions for my marriage. Because Janet and the girls were having fun, dating handsome men, acting like they were 21 again. And I found that attractive, okay? Every night when we went out, they filled my head with all the things I could do if we had an open marriage. I could date other men. My head was filled with stories of all the advantages and opportunities. And what did they say about the poor little husband who had to deal with that? I lowered my head again. It was time to be frank with him. Janet said it was never a fair arrangement, I whispered. I never wanted anyone else, Louise, he said sadly. Until that night, I was a happily married man, in love and devoted to my wife, and I would have done almost anything to make her happy. But your act showed complete disrespect for me as a husband and showed your true thoughts about our marriage. I sighed to myself. We hadn't spoken in such a long time since the night he'd agreed to this arrangement, but the thought never left me that this was the death knell to our marriage. I knew there was no going back. His love for me had faded, at least as far as I was concerned as his wife. What do we do, Mark? Keep this arrangement until the children are 18. Then we'll decide what to do. I realized what he wanted to do and burst into tears. What I didn't expect was for him to put his arms around me, and it broke me completely. I collapsed on top of him, my legs almost leaving under me as I held on to him with all my might. I knew he didn't love me, but somewhere in the back of my mind, he probably still didn't want to see his wife cry. The love may be gone, but I guess the hate was gone too. We'll spend Christmas together, Louise, he finally said. But I'm living my own life now. Our marriage is practically over. You should realize that by now. You're trying to hold on to something that has withered and died over the last year or so. And even if I stop everything, you're a very different woman now than the one I married. And I'm definitely not the man you once married, or the man you asked for. I don't want to lose you, Mark. You're my husband, and no matter what you think, I still love you. I felt him sigh. But to my joy, he didn't let go of me, his hand still gently caressing my back. But he continued to remain silent. Perhaps for the first time ever, he didn't want to say anything he knew would hurt me. I already knew the truth. He didn't need to say anything else. I knew what he was thinking, what he was going to do eventually, and I knew there was probably nothing I could do to stop it, and I couldn't hate him for that. Finally, he let go of me and stepped back, giving me a chance to wipe my eyes. I met his eyes. There was no real warmth in them, but he seemed to understand my emotions. Do you want some dinner? He asked. I almost cried again. It had been too long since the two of us had had dinner together. I smiled as we cooked something simple, but filling rather quickly, marveling at how well my husband was doing in the kitchen now. When we sat down at the table, the conversation was awkward, and some topics were definitely off limits. But after he'd had a couple beers, we started reminiscing about past times. You know, I never asked where the kids are, I finally asked. Zara is out with her friends. Matthew is at a sleepover with friends right now, and I was just enjoying a night alone. Oh, It's okay, Louise. I think we needed this conversation tonight. Zara hates me? He shook his head. No. She doesn't hate you, Louise. She's Daddy's little girl, and she doesn't like that her mom has a boyfriend. What does she think about Daddy having a girlfriend? I replied. To this, he chuckled slightly. Well, I think she's a little jealous, since if not Emily, she's certainly been neglected in the first few months. Do you love Emily, Mark? You know I love Emily. She's been my best friend for most of my life. Are you with her now? I asked quietly. No. She's been there for me as a means of support. She won't be with me until we're divorced. Wiping my cheeks, I couldn't hold back the tears. Are you serious about this? Divorce, I mean? Are you really happy in our marriage, Louise? This is the longest conversation we've had in the last year, and the longest we've been in each other's presence in months. I would give anything to have things the way they were before. But you can't turn back time, Louise. What's done is done. But he changed the subject and invited me to have a drink with him in the cabin he called his own. It was decorated with love. It was incredibly warm, and not surprisingly, the kids loved spending time there with him. We shared a bottle of wine as we continued to talk about the past. It was better than talking about the present or the future. When I woke up the next morning and felt someone's arms around me, I opened my eyes and saw my husband sound asleep. I realized that I had probably gotten a little drunk, but disappointment overtook me when I realized that nothing had happened. Mark opened his eyes and looked at me in surprise for a few seconds. Then he smiled at me. Apparently, we had a bit to drink last night. We're both still dressed, though, so... I have no indication that you made love to me, Mark. Snuggling closer, I asked, would you be interested? When was the last time you did it? Over a week ago. At that, he raised his eyebrows. I've never stopped finding you attractive, Louise. You're still a beautiful woman. Do you mean that? Of course I am. I'm not going to lie to you about something like that. Mark, I know you don't particularly like me, but would you like to entertain your wife? We haven't done anything in over a year. I really miss being with you. He sighed and pulled me tighter to him, whispering that he was sorry. I whispered back that he would never apologize. I still remembered that part of our agreement. He had closed off a part of himself from me, and he couldn't give me that part anymore. Thank you for telling me I'm still beautiful, I whispered. He disappeared to take a shower, then got dressed and had a quick breakfast. As he was leaving, I stopped him and asked if I could have a hug. He put his bag down and, for the first time in a year, hugged me. I clung to him as tightly as I could, not wanting to let him go. In a way, it was a symbol of the end. One last hug before he left. But I knew that one day we would hug one last time before our marriage ended. I love you, Mark, I whispered. I've never stopped loving you, not even for a second. He didn't say anything back. I guess he didn't want to hurt my feelings this early in the morning. I followed him to the driveway, watching him get behind the wheel of his SUV. I couldn't resist waving at him and he pulled back and honked, getting ready to leave. Mark, you're 18 now, honey, I said to my daughter, and Matthew is 16. I think it's time. Are you finally going to divorce her? You shouldn't be so excited about the idea, Zara. Dad, your marriage has been a sham for too long, and you deserve to be happy with someone who will love you. I'll have to let Matthew know. And when your mom gets back, I'll put her at the table and give her the paperwork. I'd prefer it be a joint application. That way it will go faster and without much delay. Your mom is aware that I want a divorce, so hopefully this won't come as too much of a shock to her. Did you tell Emily? Yes. She wanted to wait until we were divorced, but we've both waited long enough to be together. I'll discuss living arrangements and everything else with your mom. Louise, at least, hadn't lied to our son. Since she had started her relationship with Tom, having learned his name from our son, she had spent time with him when he traveled, but was home most of the time when she wasn't away. We were able to spend Christmas together, and it was almost a reminder of years gone by. I warned my side of the family to be friendly, and her side of the family seemed to be at least a little favorable to me. That one night when we talked longer than we had in over a year helped me thaw out her feelings. I'd even say we became friends again, but the love and intimacy was gone. But we could be around each other, in the same room, and talk to each other easily. I knew she still loved me, and I hoped that maybe I would rediscover my love for her. Although my feelings were more positive than they had been in recent months, I couldn't love her like I used to. And she came home a few nights later and I gave her a couple days to recover. I wasn't going to be cruel and file for divorce as soon as she showed up at the door. The hatred I had felt for her in those first few months was long gone. After finding my own girlfriends, I even began to understand her, but only up to a point. It was Emily who helped me stay calm most of the time. One evening, we sat down to dinner as a family, and I was pleased to see that Zara had become affectionate with her mother. I felt it had to do with her knowing what was waiting on the horizon, but she was sincere enough. As for Matthew, he always loved his mother, although I also warned him of what was in store for him. He was upset, but understood that it was necessary so that his mother and I could move on with our lives. Left alone with Louise, I asked her to wait at the table while I got the papers and placed them in front of her as soon as I sat down. She immediately cried as she realized what it was without even looking at it. "I can't apologize for doing this, Louise. The only thing that could possibly have been done differently was to do it 12 months later. But I stayed here because I wanted to be near the kids. And when I left the hate and started living my life, I didn't mind sharing a house with you. Neither of us brought lovers here to dirty up what was once our bed together, and we never flaunted our other relationships." I took her hand and squeezed it. "Read the papers, and if you agree, we can file them as a joint application. Zara is 18 now, so she is no longer considered a child. Matthew is 16. I think it would be best if he stays living here in his home until he turns 18. And what are we to do?" "That's up to you, Louise." I took a deep breath, squeezed her hand, and made sure she was looking into my eyes as I added, "I'm going to be with Emily. As soon as we get divorced, I'm going to propose to her. More than likely, I'll move in with her. As for this house, you can either buy me out or we can sell it. Are you going to stay here?" "I don't plan on leaving yet, Louise. I don't know what your plans are for the future, but now that our children are grown, I feel it's time for us both to move on." "I never wanted this, Mark," she whispered, wiping her cheeks with her free hand. "I know that, Louise. I know you wanted it to last for a short time, but it's still going on, and I've already told the other women I'm involved with that I'm going to divorce you and move on with the woman I'm in love with." I knew those words would hurt, and they did, as Louise cried even harder. I wasn't heartless and continued to hold her hand, which she clutched tightly. "If this was a year ago, Louise, I would have said things that would have broken your heart even more and caused you real pain. I don't want to do that now. I want to end our marriage on good terms if possible." "I think she'll win in the end," she murmured. "Emily warned me about breaking your heart. She's always looked out for my best interests, and I suppose you know I did the same, considering how I treated a couple of her former partners. Can we stay friends, Mark? We're already friends, aren't we?" That made her look at me and smile. "We've gotten closer in the last few months than we have in the 12 months since that request. Now it's been almost 2 years. Our relationship isn't what it used to be, and it's never been the same. But we have 2 children, and that will always bind us together. When will you move out?" "I'll coordinate a date with Emily if you want me to move out. If you want me to stay, I'll stay, but you'll have to put up with Emily coming to visit and me no longer hiding our relationship from you." "I'm not sure I can live with that," Louise whispered. "Then I'll leave, Louise. It's okay. We've already talked about it, and she's happy for me to be with her all the time. She really loves you, doesn't she?" I didn't regret anything in our relationship until that night, Louise. I fell in love with you, and marrying you was the best day of my life. The birth of our 2 children will always equal that. I still have no regrets whatsoever. I loved you with all my heart for so long, and I gave it all up. Go through the papers. I'll send them back as soon as you sign them. I'll talk to Emily and arrange a date for my move." She didn't cry much. I hugged her back, stroking her back. I realized that I had just broken her heart in return. I knew she was living in hope that we could save our marriage, but she also knew that I had talked about divorce more than once. In the evening, after going to my side of the house, I called Emily and told her that I had given the papers to Louise. She tried not to betray her excitement when she asked when I would be moving in with her. I knew I would be moving out of the house since Emily owned her house and was looking forward to me moving in. The fact that I had left the house to Louise didn't bother me, as I knew she would agree to sell it as soon as Matthew was old enough. The house wasn't as uncomfortable as I thought it would be. In fact, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. The tension eased as I finally made a decision. As for Louise, I knew she was upset, but she bravely kept her cool. Zara told me more than once that she overheard Louise talking to Tom and told him that she needed some time as she had put him on notice of what had happened. Louise disappeared the day I moved in, taking Matthew with her, who went to see her parents. They were privy to everything, including our divorce. She had signed the papers, and now all that was left was to go through the court and wait for the final judgment dissolving our marriage. Emily came around as I was packing up the things I was supposed to take to her house, which, to be honest, wasn't much. When she arrived, I greeted her with a kiss. After packing boxes and a couple suitcases into my car, she took a couple other smaller boxes with her because she insisted that her house was going to be our home, and she needed signs that we were living there together. I'm not going to lie. I left the house for the last time with a heavy heart. I had been officially married for over 20 years. We didn't celebrate that anniversary, of course. There was no point since we both knew the score of our marriage. But for most of my life, the house had been a warm, welcoming place. There are 1,000,001 good memories associated with it. Before I left, I wrote Louise a short letter that I hoped would make her smile. I no longer felt hate or bitterness. I was living my life, and it was time for Louise to live hers. When we arrived at my new home, we dropped off most of our things and left them in one of the 2 spare bedrooms, and he made sure most of my clothes were in the one that was now our bedroom. I've had several tests, Mark, she whispered. I'm still capable of having children. That made me lean back and I felt a smile appear on my face. I know we've only discussed this in passing, and I know you already have 2 grown children. We can definitely discuss it. I love you, Mark, and over the past few months I've fallen in love with you. Emily, you've been my best friend for most of my life. Believe me, I feel the same way now. When was the last time you were with someone? It was a couple months ago, Emily. I've always been uneasy about my health, but I knew you'd want to know, so I got tested as soon as I had my last time with Cindy. I'm fine. When was the last time you were with someone? She immediately became self-conscious and blushed. How long ago? Just waiting for you to start divorce proceedings, Mark. I knew I couldn't wait until it was official. She made dinner for us that night, and we sat at a small candlelit table, sharing a bottle of wine and marveling at how easily the conversation flowed between us. After that, there were no transitions to the living room or the backyard. We loaded the dishwasher and turned it on. Then she took my hand and led me into her bedroom. Emily was nothing like my wife. Shorter. Slimmer. 2 months later, a month after our divorce was finalized, and I had received the final papers, I proposed to Emily after we shared a lovely dinner at the harbor. She rushed to me as soon as I put the engagement ring on her finger, and when we got home, my bride never failed to thank her fiancé for making her so happy. Of course, I couldn't help but tell the kids about it. Zara was thrilled, as she just adores Emily. Matthew was happy, even though I knew my son well. I think he always hoped his parents would make up someday. I didn't tell Louise because, truth be told, after I moved out and during the divorce proceedings, we kept our distance. Everything was settled without having to see each other in person. Emily didn't want a lavish wedding. All she wanted was an engagement ring on her finger, a chance to wear a white dress and say the vows that would make us husband and wife. My second wedding was small, 6 months after I proposed. Only close family and friends were invited. Both my children attended the wedding. Matthew was a little surprised, but eventually accepted the invitation, figuring he might want to show loyalty to his mother. I did not invite Louise as I knew it would hurt her too much. By this point, we were socializing again and had invited her over to my house more than once. Emily didn't have a problem with Louise. I don't know how Louise felt in response, but Emily suggested after one visit that my ex-wife was living with a lot of regrets. On our wedding day, Emily was 5 months pregnant. She was radiant and looking forward to becoming a mother. I couldn't wait to be a father again either. Epilogue. Louise. Mark found his happiness the day he married Emily. I wasn't invited, and honestly, if he had, I probably wouldn't have come. I was happy for both of them. After everything that happened, I was happy that my ex-husband was happy, and I knew Emily had waited for her time. I saw pictures on social media and she looked so beautiful. I'll admit I hated her for a while after he moved out, but I just couldn't keep those feelings for long after she invited me to visit, and we talked more than once about everything that had happened. This was supposed to be my happy period. The day I married Mark was the best day of my life, matched only by the birth of our children. I regret the day I made that request to him, and I definitely regret fulfilling it the next day. I knew that day my husband stopped loving me, stopped trusting me, and that was the beginning of the end of everything. My relationship with Tom slowed down in the months following the divorce. Although I loved the man, I knew he would never leave his wife, as he had told me many times. Realizing that I needed to move on, he invited me over for dinner one night, and I told him how I felt. He understood my reasons and, although he was sad, knew that relationships like the one we had eventually come to an end. I certainly didn't blame him for anything to do with my relationship. I had only myself to blame for it. I was alone in the big house, with only my son keeping me company, as Zara had moved out shortly after my father, deciding to share an apartment with a couple of friends while she went to university. I knew she was happy about our divorce, though she never expressed her feelings too verbally, but she still blamed me for everything that had happened. I was grateful that she still talked to me and came to visit at least every weekend. I knew it would take time for our relationship to fully recover. When it came to finding love again, I realized that there are very few men like Mark, and frankly, very few men like Tom. With Mark, I had ruined a beautiful marriage, and Tom was a real good-hearted man. But the small hope that he would want to be with me all the time never materialized. I dated men from time to time. Some men seemed sincere, but most were not worth my time. Many of them were men who had gone through bitter divorces. I was always honest about the reasons for the divorce, and I was called a whore and other names more than once. Others, however, thought I would easily please them. Several years passed until I met a man who seemed worthy. His name was John, and he was a couple years older than me. Good job, his own apartment, and he seemed to really like me. We dated for a few weeks before I finally decided to sleep with him. He was a good enough lover, caring enough to make sure I had an orgasm, but he didn't have the feelings I'd had with Tom or the fireworks I'd enjoyed with Mark. But I decided that's how I was going to go on with my life. The love of my life was gone. Now all that was left was to find a man good enough for me to grow old with. But even that turned out to be a false dawn. It was on Christmas Day that I learned the truth. Upon arriving at his apartment, I found no sign of him, even though we had discussed our plans for weeks. Looking around his apartment, I searched for anything that might tell me where he was. Eventually, I found paperwork, an itemized bill that listed a different address. Without realizing why, I took it with me and drove to it. The house was in the suburbs. Pulling over to the side of the road, I saw his car parked in the driveway and another car next to it that I didn't recognize. As I got out of the car and walked to the front door, I felt a knot in my stomach. Ringing the bell, I waited a few seconds before the door opened, and the face of an unfamiliar woman appeared in front of me. "Hello, can I help you?" "Yes, I'm looking for John." "And who are you?" "I'm not going to tell you my name, but I assume you're his wife." "Yes." "Well, then I am his mistress. I'm very sorry, but I didn't know you existed." "You—" Her eyes darkened for a few seconds. "You didn't know he was married?" "Believe me, I was in an open marriage and was a major cause of his downfall, and I have the scars to prove it. John never talked about being married." I raised my left hand. "He never had a ring on his finger. He stopped wearing it a long time ago. Said it had to do with work." I could feel the anger radiating from her. "Tell me everything you can." "Who is it, sweetheart?" came his voice from the back of the house. "Just someone looking for the street, honey. I'll be there in a couple minutes." I told her everything I could, particularly details that only I could know if I were close to him. I told her details about the apartment he kept, details of our relationship, when we met, how often. I watched her mull it all over, and finally she sighed. "I can't thank you enough for this, whoever you are." John appeared next to her, and I heard him whisper, "Oh, shit. You're an asshole, John. If I had known you were married, I never would have gotten involved with you," I hissed. "I'm sorry." "Diane," his wife said to me as I met her gaze again. "I'm sorry, Diana. I've been through this shit once before. I had no idea." I looked at John again. "You're such an idiot. And by the way, it's over between us. I never lied about my past or why I got divorced. I know I screwed up. And you're just a cheating piece of shit." Getting back in the car, I wasn't going to cry over this piece of human garbage. I felt sorry for Diana, though. I hoped they didn't have kids, or if they did, they were grown, so the divorce wouldn't affect them. No doubt he'd claim I was crazy or lying, but I knew intimate details about this man that only a wife should know. Driving aimlessly around town, I had no idea where to go. The kids were with Emily and Mark and their families. I didn't want to get involved, even though I had a standing invitation from both of them. I stopped at the house I'd kept after the divorce, but I couldn't decide to go inside and spend Christmas alone. Sighing to myself, I put the transmission in gear and drove across town to the house my ex-husband now called home. Pulling up to the house, I walked up to the door and knocked. Mark opened the door after a few seconds, took one look at me, opened the door wider and hugged me while I cried. "I kept ruining everything," I sobbed, snuggling into his chest. What I hadn't expected in any way was to feel another person hugging me. "Stay with us," Emily said. "You're still family, Louise." "Mark?" "You were always welcome to join us, Louise. Our children are here, and you get to spend time with our daughter, too. I can introduce you as Aunt Louise." I leaned back and looked at his handsome face. He hadn't changed much in the 5 years since our divorce. He looked just as happy as he had in the early years of our marriage. Are you sure you're okay? Both of them took one of my hands each. We're sure, Mark replied. It's Christmas, a time for family, a time for gratitude, but also a time for forgiveness. I've already forgiven you, Louise. I think it's time for you to forgive yourself. My daughter smiled and hugged me as I held my grandson, whom Zara had given birth to earlier in the year. Mark's parents were friendly to me as always. They were introduced to Emily's parents, who were polite and friendly. Matthew hugged me for what seemed like hours. My son is now a young, strong, broad man. After spending the day with such a loving family, I was finally able to smile. Zara, her husband and child, left late in the afternoon, and Matthew flew out shortly after, hoping to spend time with his girlfriend. Both parents left early, leaving me with Mark, Emily, and their 3-year-old daughter. I explained what had happened while we sipped our wine. Both were sympathetic and understanding. Mark offered to go knock his block out, which made me smile. I couldn't stay with them all night, and as I got up to leave, Emily was the first to suggest a place to stay for the night. I'm going to sell the house, I told them. It's a big place that I don't need anymore. I'm going to find an apartment or something. Please stay tonight, Louise, Mark added. We managed to live together for almost 2 years when things were going downhill. Now that we've become friends, you don't have to go away at our expense. Are you sure? I noticed them glance over and then smile. Pack your things, Louise. You'll always be welcome in our home, Emily replied. Enjoying a long shower, I watched from the doorway as Mark read a story to their daughter. More than once, I had to hold back from crying, remembering how he had done the same thing for our daughter once long ago. Heading to the guest room that Emily had quickly prepared for me, Mark gave me a hug before Emily did the same. I hope we can be good friends in the future, she said quietly to me. If it means I get to see him more often. Do you still love him? I nodded at that question, barely holding back tears. I'm so sorry, Louise. I hope you know what I mean. I'm sorry too. I heard their bedroom door slam shut and close the door to my bedroom. As I lay in bed, I hated the fact that I was alone, but it was better than any other option but being with Mark. Lying there, I pondered my life and where it was going. Maybe I should give up dating and focus on my career and grandchildren. There wasn't an ounce of jealousy in Emily. She had the man she wanted, and I certainly wasn't a threat. Maybe I could just be a friend to her. Tomorrow was another day. Eventually, I would figure it out. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.